Yeah, I guess I am going to do something. Fortunately, for us all, I'm not singing. There was a poet named Dylan Thomas. He lived in the first half of the 20th century. He was well known to all those who appreciated poetry and eccentric personalities. He was Welsh. He had a great Welsh accent. And he wrote a story, a short story, that was recorded quite accidentally on Cademan Records, and now Cademan, of course, records have turned into CDs. But in any event, it's a great little story. It's called A Child's Christmas in Wales. And you'll have to imagine someone who was in his 50s writing this in the 1930s or 40s about a town, a little town perhaps the size of this room, on Christmas Eve. A Child's Christmas in Wales. One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the sea town corner, now and out of all sound, except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. I plunge my hands into the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays, resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea, and out come Mrs. Prothero and the firemen. It was on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden, waiting for cats with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December in my memory is white as Lapland, though there were no reindeer, but they were cats. Patient, cold, and callous, our hands wrapped in socks, we waited to snowball the cats. Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasined trappers from Hudson Bay, would hurl our deadly snowballs. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And we ran down the garden with snowballs in our arms toward the house, and smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was vomilating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing Rowan like a town crier at Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house, laden with snowballs, and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with a slipper. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong. "They won't be there," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving his slipper as though he were conducting. "Do something," he said. And we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero. It ran out of the house to the telephone box. "Let's call the police as well," Jim said, "and the ambulance. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires." But we only called the fire brigade. And soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. And when the firemen turned off the hose and were standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing, always. She looked at the three tall firemen in their shining helmets, standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, "Would you like anything to read?" Years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves and whales and birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills, when we sang and wallowed all night and day in caves, and we chased the English and the bears, before the motor car, before the wheel, before the horse, we rode the daft and happy hills bareback. It snowed, and it snowed. But here a small boy says, it snowed last year too. I made a snowman, and my brother knocked it down, and I knocked my brother down, and then we had tea. But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from whitewashed buckets down the sky, it came shawling out of the ground and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure grandfather moss. Minutely ivied the walls and settled on the postman, opening the gate like a dumb, numb thunderstorm of white torn Christmas cards. Were there postmen then, too? With sprinkling eyes and wind-cherry noses and spread frozen feet, they crunched up to the doors and mittened on them manfully. But all that the children could hear was a ringing of bells. You mean that the postman went rat-a-tat-tat and the doors rang? I mean that the bells the children could hear were inside them. I only hear thunder sometimes, never bells. There were church bells, too. Inside them? No, no, no. In the black, snow-white belfries tugged by bishops and storks, and they rang their tidings over the frozen foam of the powder and ice cream hills. It seemed that all the churches boomed for joy under my window. Get back to the postman. They were just ordinary postmen, fond of walking and dogs and Christmas and the snow. They knocked on the doors with blue knuckles. Ours is a black knocker. And then they stood on a white welcome mat with little drifted porches and huffed and puffed, making ghosts with their breath, and jogged from foot to foot like small boys wanting to go out. And then the presents. And then the presents. And the cold postman with the rose on his button nose tinkled down the tea tray slipping run, the chilly glinting hill. He went in his ice-bound boots like a man on fishmonger slabs. He wagged his bag like a frozen camel skunk, dizzily turned the corner on foot, and by God, he was gone. Get back to the presents. They were the useful presents, engulfing mufflers of the old coach days, and mittens made for giant sloths. Zebra scars with substance like silky gum, blinding tam-o'-shanters like patchwork tea cozies, and balaclavas for victims of hit-shrieking tribes. From aunts who wore wool next to the skin, there were mustached and raspy vests. It made you wonder why the aunts had any skin left at all. And once I had a little crocheted nose bag from an aunt, now, alas, no longer living with us. And pictureless books in which small boys, though worn with quotations not to, would skate and fire dials, pond and dig and drown. And books that told me everything about the Wassons and why. Go to the useless presents. Bags of moist and many-colored jelly babies and a folded flag and a false nose, a tram conductor's cap and a machine gun, punch tickets and rang a bell, never a catapult. A celluloid duck that made me pressed a most unduck-like sound, a mewing moo, and a painting book which I could make the grass, the trees, the sea, and the animals, any color I pleased, and still the sky-blue sheep are grazing the red field under the rainbow-billed and pea-green birds. There are hard-boiled toffee, fudge, crunches, crackers, humbugs, glaziers, marzipan, butterwelsh for the Welsh, and troops of bright tin soldiers who, if they could not fight, could always run. And a whistle to make the dogs bark, to wake up the old man next door, to make him beat on the wall with a stick to shake our picture off the wall. And then it was breakfast under the balloons. Were there uncles like in our house? There are always uncles at Christmas. The same uncles. And on Christmas morning, with dog disturbing whistle and sugar fags, I would scour the town, for news of the little world, and always find a dead bird by the post office, or by the white deserted swings. Perhaps a robin, all but one of his fires out. Mistletoe hung from the gas brackets, the front parlors. Some few large men sat in front parlors without their collars, uncles almost certainly, trying their new cigars, holding them out judiciously at arm's length, returning them to their mouths, coughing, then holding them out again as though waiting for the explosion. And some few small aunts, not wanted in the kitchen, or anywhere else for that matter, sat on the very edge of their chairs, poised and brittle, afraid to break, like faded cups and saucers. For dinner, we had turkey and blazing pudding, and after dinner, the uncles sat in front of the fire, loosened all the buttons, put their large, moist hands over their watch chains, groaned a little, and slept. Mothers, aunts, and sisters scuttled to and fro. Aunt Bessie, who had already been frightened twice by a clockwork mouse, whimpered at the sideboard and had some elderberry wine. The dog was sick. Auntie Dossie had to have 3 aspirins, but Auntie Hannah, who liked port, stood in the middle of the snowbound backyard singing like a big bosom thrush. I would blow up balloons to see how big they would blow up to, and when they burst, which they all did, the uncles jumped and rumbled. In the rich and heavy afternoon, the uncles breathing like dolphins and snow descending, I would sit among the festoons of Chinese lanterns and nibble dates. Or I would go out, my bright new boots squeaking in the white world onto the hill to call on Jim and Dan and Jack to pad through the streets, leaving huge footprints. I bet people will think there's been hippos. What would you do if you saw a hippo coming down the street? I go like this, bang! I throw him over the railings, roll him down the hill, and then I tickle him under the ear and he'd wag his tail. What would you do if you saw 2 hippos? Iron, flanked and bellowing, he-hippos clanked and battered through the scudding snow towards us as we passed Mr. Daniel's house. Let's post Mr. Daniel a snowball through his letterbox. Let's write things in the snow. Let's write, Mr. Daniel looks like a spaniel. Or we walked on the white shore. Can the fishes see it snowing? We returned home through the poor streets, where only few children fumbled with bare red fingers. And then, at home, at tea, the recovered uncles would be jolly, and the ice cake loomed in the center of the table like a big marble grave. Auntie Hannah laced her teeth with rum, because it was only once a year. Bring out the tall tales now that we told by the fire. Tall tales, ghosts wooed like owls in the long nights when I dared not look over my shoulder. Animals lurked in the cubbyhole under the stairs, and the gas meter ticked. And I remember that we went singing carols once, when there wasn't the shading of a moon to light the streets. At the end of a long road was a drive that led to a large house, and we stumbled up the darkness of the drive that night, each one of us afraid, each one holding a stone in his hand in case, and all of us too brave to say a word. The wind through the trees made noises as of old and unpleasant, and maybe even wet-footed men's wheezing in caves. We reached the bulk of the house. What shall I give them? Hark the herald? No, said Jack. Good King Wenceslas. I'll count 3. 1, 2, 3, and we began to sing. In the snow-felt darkness around the house that was occupied by nobody we knew, we stood close together and near the dark door. Good King Wenceslas looked down on the feast of Stephen, and then a small, dry voice, like the voice of someone who has not spoken for a long time, joined our singing. A small, dry, eggshell voice from the other side of the door. A small, dry voice through the keyhole. And when we stopped running, we were outside our house. The front room was lovely. Balloons floated under the hot water bottle, gulping gas. Everything was good again and shone over the town. Perhaps it was a ghost, Jim said. Perhaps it was trolls.